All right, so let's talk about direct and equal theories related to animal rights. And let's begin kind of at the foundation of the theory, the first sort of stepping point. It's fundamental assumption. And it's an assumption that has to do with the relationship between justice and discrimination. And we've talked about this idea before that even though we tend to sometimes talk about discrimination as if it's a bad thing, um, it's actually a really important skill, mental faculty to develop. You need to be able to discriminate in order to simply survive. You've got to distinguish between toxic waste and food, for example. That's discriminating. Um, but also, I assume you're in college because you want to develop your discrimination skills. You want to be able to discriminate between um, good ideas and bad ideas, between false statements and true statements, or between good art and bad art, whatever. You want to be able to make judgments that allow you to make distinctions. And that's what discrimination is. Now, with regards to ethics and questions about justice and fairness, discrimination requires that you look at the factors that are involved in any particular situation and that you determine, first of all, which factors are relevant to making a moral choice and how you would uh, use those factors to make that choice, right? So for example, let's say that you have two people. One person just finished an enormous meal. They're just stuffed beyond belief. And then there's another person who's starving to death, literally. And you've got, some amount of food that's the amount that you would ordinarily serve to a normal person for a single meal. And you have to distribute this food between these two people. So you could just give them both an equal amount. But would that be fair? Would it be just to give them an equal amount and say, I'm not making any value judgments here. Here's half for each of you. Or would it be justifiable to give the starving person a greater portion or perhaps even all of the food and deny the other person any food at all? And I think you could make an argument that the fact that one is starving and one is not wanting any more food, that allows you to make a judgment about what's fair that doesn't necessarily result in you distributing the resource equally. Okay. Now we do this all the time. We have to. Sometimes we have factors like intelligence, nationality, age, sex, race, economic status. We'd have a laundry list here, right? We have things that we think about and we consider when determining what the just thing to do is, and we discriminate. So if we have a limited number of seats in a medical school, and we have more applicants than we have seats for, which of these criteria would we use in determining who gets that seat or who gets those limited number of seats? Would we take the age of people into account? Maybe. Would we take their intelligence into account? Probably. Would we take their nationality into account? That's a tougher one. I don't know how you would determine that the nationality of someone is relevant to whether or not they get medical training, right? And same thing with like race or sex or economic status. We would have to ask ourselves, are these things relevant to the question about who gets admitted to medical school or who gets to vote or who gets to go out and buy a gun or who gets to represent themselves in a jury trial, right? And you can see that for all of those issues, various of these factors are going to come into play. And we're going to say, look, if you discriminate against someone and say you're not allowed to own and carry a firearm because you're 5 years old, we might not say, well, that's ageist. But if somebody said, oh, I've got to hire somebody for this job as a computer programmer, and I'm 32 and I like hanging out with 32-year-olds, so I'm going to hire somebody to do this job who's 32. We might say that's not really fair. That's not a relevant criteria. You should be hiring the person who's going to do the best they can in the job. And this is where direct and equal animal rights theorists come in, and they say, like, all right, so what about this category of species? Is it really fair? Is it appropriate to use species as a category for determining who gets what kind of moral status between humans and animals? Is it appropriate to use, would it, a direct and equal theorist in animal rights would say, look, you don't allow race to be used in determining who gets the right to be assumed innocent until proven guilty. Sorry, let me get rid of this. You don't get race to determine, use race as a category to determine who gets the right to a jury trial. So why are you using species as the criteria for determining what living creatures get what kinds of moral consideration? And Jeremy Bentham raised this concern, right? Our utilitarian friend. And with regard to animals, he said, look, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk. The only thing that's relevant is can they suffer? Because as a good utilitarian, remember, Bentham is trying to maximize the amount of happiness and decrease the amount of suffering for the greatest number. And for Bentham, what sort of organism is experiencing that happiness is irrelevant. So you're sitting here right now watching this video, and I'm sure you're just having a wonderfully great time. You're feeling completely contented and satisfied and stimulated and so on and so forth. Now imagine you took all of that and you put that same exact sensation in a dog. Well, if you're a utilitarian, does it matter whether it's a dog or it's you that's experiencing that? Or does it matter just that amount of euphoria that I'm sure you're experiencing be experienced by something? And Bentham would say yes. And it's not appropriate to say that because the dog is experiencing that exact same thing, if it is the exact same thing, that it's somehow less important. And you can fast forward to today, an ethicist named Peter Singer, which I'm going to talk to you more about here in a minute, he says kind of the same thing. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. I think it's a pretty powerful statement, actually. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification, okay, for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. Now, how far you take that into consideration is what's on the table here. But essentially what Singer's saying here is, if a dog is suffering and you think that suffering matters, and we all probably do, the fact that it's a dog experiencing the suffering doesn't justify you ignoring the suffering, okay? So Peter Singer wrote this extremely famous book in 1975 called Animal Liberation, A New Ethics for Our Treatment of Animals. And there's actually an excerpt from this book in the modules that I put up there. I think it's called All Animals Are Equal. It's a short essay, but it's a really good piece of philosophy. You don't have to read it, but if you want to read a top-notch animal rights argument, that's one of your go-to pieces. So you maybe take a look at that in the modules. Now here's how Peter Singer's thinking works, at least part of his thinking. Think about this, because it's really it's a good argument, okay? It's what's called the argument from marginal cases. And the first premise is this: in order to conclude that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status, and therefore that no animals deserve a full and equal moral status, then there must be some property, call it P, that all and only human beings have that can ground such a claim. Okay? Now read that sentence again. It's a really important sentence. Essentially what he's saying is, if you and I want to make the argument that every single human being deserves full and equal moral status. In other words, there aren't some people that have more moral status than others. We don't say like, oh, well, if you're wealthy, your life is more valuable than if you're poor. Or if you're a man, your life is more valuable. It's more important to treat you good than it is somebody who's not a man. So Singer's saying, if you want to say that, and at the same time, you want to say that no animals have that same moral status, you've got to identify some property that all people have that no animals have. And that seems true, right? Because if what we said before is the case, that justifiable discrimination requires you to discriminate based on some sort of relevant feature, and that relevant feature would justify you in allocating a certain number of rights or certain type of rights to one but not the other, Singer's essentially saying, yeah, and so if you're going to grant more moral status to people than animals, you've got to identify the feature that humans have that non-humans don't have. That seems true. The second premise is this: any property that you identify that only human beings have is a property that some human beings probably lack. Think about that. So we talked a little bit about this in some of our conversation with the abortion discussion. Human beings have rationality. Do all of them? Like, does a 1-day-old human being have the capacity of rationality? Human beings have emotion. Do all of them? Human beings have the ability to make things. Do all of them? So I could probably go through, and I've done this before, you try to list out the properties that human beings have, or find a property that human beings have, that no human beings lack. And you're not going to be able to find that property. So that leads Singer to his third premise, which is, all right, now any given property that you've identified that all human beings have is going to be a property that most animals have as well. Then they might not have it to the same degree, but they're going to have that same property, right? So again, brainstorm. What's the property that human beings have that no animals have? The ability to communicate? That's debatable. The ability to do logic and rationality, to think linearly? That's debatable. The ability to experience emotion. Having a sense of fairness. And I've told you before that there's lots of studies coming out right now that show there are many different kinds of animals that grieve, that have a sense of injustice, that have a perceived sense of fairness. So again, you take these three premises together, that in order to treat non-human animals as having lower moral status and lower moral considerability than human animals, you've got to find some property that humans possess that animals don't, that justifies you making that distinction, making that discrimination. And Singer's betting you can't. Therefore, there's no way to defend the claim that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status. See how that worked? It's a pretty good argument, right? So you would have to figure out a way to disagree with one of those first three premises in order to reject that conclusion. Those are really strong but very simple premises that lead very powerfully to that conclusion. Now, Singer also made a different kind of argument. Okay, he made an argument called the principle of equal consideration of interests, and this argument kind of it works like this: the essence of the principle of equal consideration of interests is that we give equal weight in our moral deliberations to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. Okay, in other words, if you're going to do something that creates a consequence that another has to contend with, it's immoral to not consider that consequence that you've created for someone else. Now, this wouldn't apply to things like ink pens, right? So that when I break an ink pen in half, I've created a consequence, but I've not really created a consequence for the ink pen because the ink pen's not an experiencing thing. The ink pen doesn't have any experience of brokenness. So I don't have to consider the consequence on the pen of my actions. But if I skin Fluffy alive, I've created a set of consequences for Fluffy that Fluffy now has to contend with. And Singer saying, there's no moral justification for you to refuse to take those consequences for Fluffy into account. And if you use the criteria of Fluffy's a dog and you're a human, you're being what Singer would call speciesist, okay? And so speciesism functions like this, that racism is using race as a category to unjustifiably discriminate among people. So sexism is the same thing. So we can go through all these isms and we'd say like, oh, those kinds of isms refer to a morally unjustifiable way of distinguishing among things based on arbitrary category selections. So that when you say, women shouldn't have the right to vote, you're using that category inappropriately, unjustifiably, as a way of distributing a right. And Singer and other utilitarians and animal rights activists would say that when you use species as a way of discriminating, again, as a way of distributing out moral status, when you use species, you're doing something very similar. And He's not the only one to say this. And you might be a speciesist if you regard members of one species as morally more or less important by virtue of their membership in that species. Okay? So a lot of animal rights activists make this argument that racism, sexism, speciesism, these are all bad, and they're all equally bad. And Singer makes this argument really powerfully in that essay, All Animals Are Equal. Now, this image that you have up on the screen here is it's kind of a lousy image, because racism, sexism, and speciesism, they are all discrimination, but that doesn't tell us anything, because discrimination itself isn't inherently bad. It would be better if this image said, you know, it's all arbitrary discrimination, or it's all inappropriate discrimination, or it's all unfair discrimination. And this is the argument that these animal rights activists make. You can see, you know, here's the analogy being made that slavery and factory farming are essentially morally equivalent. And this is where animal rights activists can really make some other types of justice advocates very angry, because the perception here is that, well, it's not just the perception, it's the fact, is that these animal rights activists are equating humans and animals and saying these are on the same moral level. And for animal rights activists who don't believe that, they're perceiving this as somehow dehumanizing the people by unfairly elevating the moral status of non-human creatures. And you could sort of, this one created a tremendous stir when it came out. This is, I think, from PETA, had this as a big, huge, I should have put this one up there. It was actually a big, huge display that was put out in front of a building, and it says, during the 7 years between 1938 and 1945, 12 million people perished in the Holocaust. The same number of animals is killed every 4 hours for food in the US alone. The Holocaust on your plate. And I remember at the time this came out that there were some Jewish groups that were just livid at this comparison. But you'd have to go back and unemotionally consider Singer's argument, this one here, which is he would challenge you and say, like, all right, tell me the thing that makes people and their suffering more morally significant than the suffering of non-people or non-animals. And he would challenge us. You tell me, what is it about the quality of suffering, or is some unique property that human beings have, that they all have, that no animals have, that justifies your sense of outrage when I compare the suffering of different species? Okay? So think about this, and maybe on the discussion board, take up Singer's challenge. In particular, the marginal case argument. Is there any property that all humans have that no non-humans have that would justify granting higher moral status to humans? Okay? Now, the important thing here is it has to be a property that all human beings have, that no animals have. It can't be a property that just some human beings have, because we would just use that as a basis for discriminating against human beings as well. There are things that some human beings have that not all human beings have. So, athleticism is one thing that some human beings have that allow us to give them permission to be on our Olympic team that other people are denied the opportunity to explore because they don't have that same athleticism. So when we're talking about moral status, we're working off the assumption that we believe that all human beings have equal moral status, and that no human beings, unless there's a good justification, that no human beings have less moral status than other human beings. And so if that's the case, what's the property that they all have that gives them that shared moral status that no animals have that'll justify us excluding animals from that same moral considerability? Or maybe take up question number 2. Singer argues that to give non-human animals any less moral consideration than we give to humans is speciesist. He argues further that speciesism is just as evil as human racism and sexism. In other words, it is as wrong to regard a non-human animal as having less moral worth because it is non-human as it is to regard any human as having less moral worth because he or she belongs to a particular race or sex. Do you agree or disagree? So I'm going to put these up on the discussion board. As always, it's optional. Again, I love reading what you guys say. It's the highlight of my day. So if you have a thought you want to share, please do so. If not, don't feel obligated to.